reaching for the one who loves us. No one has to teach a class on need. No baby has to learn how to cry. Written in the DNA of humanity is a primal drive to reach for what you dare to obtain. Over 2,000 years ago, Jesus walked the planet, and as he went from town to town, people in desperate need would reach for him. Little children, frenzied crowds, blind Bartimaeus, drowning Peter, doubting Thomas, bleeding woman. Reaching for the one they had heard so much about. Out of options, tired of distractions, overcome with burden, they reached, full of faith that if they could just touch the hem of his garment, they would be healed, made whole, restored, because the one they were reaching for had been reaching for them all along. It was he who reached high to heaven, breaking bread and nourishing the masses. It was he who extended his hands low to wash the disciples' feet. It was he who stretched out his arms to take our nails. And when the woman grabbed onto the thread of his robe, she found he was the prize. There was a hospital in the hem, grace in the garment, compassion in his cloak. And that is why we've gathered here today, to reach out, touch Jesus, be healed, be seen, be given power, be saved, to reach for the one who's been reaching for us. Come near to God, and he will come near to you.
Well, good morning. For those of you who I have not met as often, my name is Larry Ginrich, and I have worshiped here for about 24 years after I met Kendra, and we live right here in East Petersburg. And this morning, I'm glad to be sharing in this Hall of Faith series. I've found it to be a growth experience for me, and I want to thank all of those who have led different parts of this learning together. So I would ask that for your open hearts and minds as I share what God has placed on my heart as we investigate the life of this next member of the Hall of Faith. I've titled this Walking by Faith. And let me say at the beginning, when I first took on the task of sharing about Abram or Abraham, I asked several people, what do you first think of when you hear about this person? I'm not going to name names, but at least one person said, very first thing I think about is how Sarah and Abram laughed at God. Another mentioned how old Abram was when God asked him to leave everything he knows, or he knew. He was about 75. For me, as the oldest son of a preacher, the part that jumped out at me as a kid was when God tested Abraham by asking him to sacrifice his oldest son, and that he was prepared to do that. I'm not sure they should teach that to impressionable young children, but that's what it was. And I know there are a variety of people here today, some who like history and some who don't. To those who don't, please bear with me. I'm hoping some of what I share today will help explain why I feel this story of Abraham and Sarah is critical to our lives today as followers of Jesus. I also think that it's important to look at the context where these biblical accounts occur. It helps me to understand the realities of who, what, when, where, and why. So when God called Abram to leave his homeland, he was living in the region of Ur of the Chaldeans, traditionally the city of Ur in southern Mesopotamia, which is now Iraq. The surrounding culture and society of Abram's time were deeply influenced by that culture, and so I want to give just a quick overview of that. As we do this, let's look at the scriptures together. If you have your Bible, please turn to Genesis 12, 1-3. Also, if you're using a Bible from the pews, it's page 11. I will be reading from the New Living Translation. Genesis 12, verses 1-3. The Lord had said to Abram, "Leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. I'll bless those who bless you and curse those who treat you with contempt. All the families on earth will be blessed through you." So, just to be clear, when God asked Abram to leave his homeland, he was asking him to give up a lot. Abram would likely have been a city dweller in one of the largest and most modern cities of his day. Compare it to maybe New York or Paris. Was a thriving city with advanced architecture, infrastructure. It had large temples and government buildings. It had residential neighborhoods with multi-story houses. It was a hub of commerce for people all across the region, and it had a very structured hierarchy. There were kings and priests and nobles, and there were merchants and artists and farmers, and there were slaves. And the area was very much something we call polytheistic. People worshiped a large number of gods, and they were often associated with natural forces or celestial bodies. The god of the heavens, the god of the winds and storms, the god of love and war, the moon god. And as you can see in the picture here, there were temples called ziggurats, and they were central to worship and civic life. In this is an illustration of what the temple would have looked like, a massive, huge building. The culture was steeped in idolatry, which contrasted sharply with the call of Yahweh, the one God who called Abram to leave. God was calling now Abraham out of his current life to go where he could worship God alone, away from the culture and the king who celebrated many gods. He was moving out of obedience to a deeply held belief. So let's look at a little bit of Hebrews telling of this time. Hebrews 11, 8 to 12, and it starts on page 1192 if you're looking in the Bibles here. By faith, Abraham, when called to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he didn't know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And by faith, even Sarah, who was well past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as sands on the seashore. These verses are part of a larger story of Abraham listening to God's radical call and moving. So I want to break this down into a couple parts. First, faith in action. Abraham left the prosperous and advanced city, to go to an unknown land based on the call of God in his life, despite the uncertainties. Trust in God's promises. His journey and Sarah's reflect their belief in God's promises of land, descendants, and blessings. Hebrews here portrays him as someone who believed in things that were unseen. It's the sort of the theme of Hebrews 11, right? The assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And it was a pilgrimage to a heavenly goal. The text uses in verses 9 and 10 the physical journey to Canaan as a metaphor for the spiritual journey toward a heavenly homeland. Abraham and Sarah's life exemplify seeking eternal fulfillment rather than temporary comfort. And then faith in the impossible. The passage and laughing at God highlights where they took something that was impossible, but by believing in it, were able to move through so God could fulfill God's promises. So today I want to use Abraham and Sarah's faith and their willingness to follow God's call as a jumping off point to several stories I know about people called to leave and go to new places out of faith. Maybe the situation isn't quite the same. Abraham was being called to leave a polytheistic, many-God place and follow God into the desert or into a place alone. Not everyone in the stories that you will hear had that same experience, but they all felt a call to go. And as I start this part, I should say, I recognize the privilege of the opportunity I have to know these stories and to research them. I'm thankful to God for that ability. And I also should point out, I am not suggesting that the stories that I am sharing are better or more important than any of the stories that you may come with. This congregation has many people who have left and gone to new places, or left and gone for a season and returned. We have connections to those people in our day-to-day lives. My stories are the ones I can tell because they're my stories. Yes, that arrow points to me. I was about 5 years old watching the older kids play. My parents had been living in northern Indiana, surrounded by most of my mom's 9 siblings and their families. Before that, we had lived in Colorado, where my dad's family was, and in Oregon, where he was going to school. But Dad felt a call to pastoring. Church leaders were asking him to move his wife and 3 boys under 6 years old to extreme northern Michigan to work and serve at a small church there. We lived in a small single-wide trailer, had 1 car that Dad drove to work. Work was a number of miles away, and Mom was left with us 3 boys, knowing literally no one in the area when we first arrived. It was an example of my parents feeling a call on their lives and moving to a new place with lots of uncertainties. What you see on this screen is a letter written by the Quaker leader Francis Pastorius in 1697. He was a German-born settler and leader in colonial Pennsylvania, most famous for starting Germantown, which is now part of Philadelphia, and was an early advocate for religious tolerance and felt strongly against slaveholding. This text reflects what he and many others feel in what was called the Palatinate, which is now part of Germany. It was at the crossroads of a couple empires, and it kept changing hands, right? There'd be a war, and someone would take over, and then another war, and someone would take over. And the people who were just trying to live there were feeling oppressed. Since it might be a little hard to read that, I'm going to read the text here. It says, "Our princes had promised so much, but keeping what they had promised did not seem to be their duty. Are we really that evil that they felt justified to break their promises? It's getting worse from day to day. The only right we have is to keep our mouths shut. It is not seeming, apparently, for subjects to register complaints, and the serfs have to obey their masters. Our brethren are being expelled. What we have instead of law and justice is the police. Today that one is singled out, tomorrow someone else. Every German has been declared an outlaw. Therefore, we leave our fatherland behind." The house that you see in this picture was built by my 7th great-grandfather, Theodorus Eby, whose family had previously already been forced to leave their farm in Switzerland to go to this area where they were given a little bit more freedom to worship as they want. But as things continued to get bad in that area, he moved to where Peters Road is between New Holland and Intercourse and built this house. At this point, Lancaster wasn't even a county. Likely there were only a few hundred white families in the whole area. In addition to the Amish and Mennonites and other German-speaking immigrants, there were a few Scots-Irish. That was it. All were seeking economic opportunities and freedom from political unrest and religious persecution. And the Swiss-German Mennonites and Lutherans and other German-speaking refugees were not exactly welcomed. By 1717, the German speakers were coming so fast the colonial governor protested and wanted the English government to be more stringent to keep the Germans out. And yet, barely 2 generations later, Theodorus's grandson, George Eby, who lived over near Hammer Creek, went to Canada in 1804. He and others could see another conflict coming between the United States and England, and he was determined to be able to worship freely and not to be involved in this war. So he and a few others went 500 miles to what was then called Upper Canada, now Ontario, walking across mountains, through swamps, no bridges, over streams and rivers, again, following God's call on their life. They did this primarily on foot, but accompanied by a few first examples of what King called the Conestoga wagons pictured there. A final story from my family. This part of my family's desire to worship freely led them to uproot themselves not once, not twice, but 3 times. Early Mennonites in Holland had been harassed and killed for their faith, so many fled to what was then called Prussia. Now it's part of Poland. The picture here shows my 3rd great-grandfather, Heinrich Duick, who was born there in 1839. By that time, it was getting harder and harder to stay there. So his dad, Peter, took the family to a new place where they were going to be allowed to have the freedom that they wanted to worship. That place is what is now Ukraine. But by the time he was an adult and married to Helena, who's in this picture, things had gone down there. Mennonites were being forced to take positions against their beliefs, and the government had announced a Russification plan that was ending any privileges that they had, particularly exemption from military service and the ability to speak German in their schools. While this is not my family's house pictured in Ukraine, it was a Mennonite house in the same area. So some of them had become very wealthy and become embedded into those communities. But once again, they followed God's call to leave everything and to move to a new place in the wilds called Kansas. An interesting side note here, again, because I'm a history buff. This isn't my family's business, but it shows the scale and how successful some of them had become. As part of the deal to come to the area, the Russian czars gave Mennonites a privilege that nobody else had. They were allowed to brew vinegar and beer. This is what Heinrich and Helena did. So imagine their surprise when they got off the train in Hillsboro, Kansas, and learned it was a dry area and beer was not allowed. They had to learn a new business. They had to learn a new language of English. They had to start over. And our family history has a couple examples of times they tried a store and it didn't work. They tried to farm and they went broke. They tried to do this because they had moved everything and left all of this behind. It isn't just my ancestors who have made decisions about being willing to risk everything to stand up for God's call in their life. This congregation has 2 items showing part of this history. These are images, but you can see them over here in the fellowship hall on the far wall if you want to read them. They are artwork using the words shared by Benjamin Hershey, who was the Mennonite bishop here back in 1775. Here was a group who had just arrived in the last generation, being willing to risk it all again to stand up for what they believed in. I'll read just a few words of the words you can read back there on the plaques. We have dedicated ourselves to serve all men in everything that can be helpful to the preservation of men's lives, but we find no freedom in giving or doing or assisting in anything by which men's lives are destroyed or hurt. They also said it is our fixed principle, rather than to take up arms to defend our king, our country, or ourselves, we would suffer all that is dear to us to be rent from us. That means to be taken from us, even life itself. And we think this not out of contempt for authority, but herein we act agreeable to what we think is the mind and the will of our Lord Jesus. After all that history, you might be saying, so what? Those are fun stories. They show your family's heritage. Big deal. Well, I want to reach back a few weeks to where Josh shared about Joseph. In both the Old and the New Testament, we see people who followed the call of God on their life, even in the face of danger and struggle. His four ideas I kept his four ideas in front of me as I was looking at this lesson. Obey God immediately, obey God if it doesn't make sense, obey God if you don't see a personal benefit, and obey God to completion. If you remember, that was in the context of Joseph, but I'm sharing them as guides for all of us. So I have three things that I would like to explore as ways that match this so what. Faith requires trust in God's plan. Abraham's journey exemplifies a deep trust in God's promises, even when the plan is unclear. As we saw in Hebrews 11, we are going to have to learn to step out in faith, trusting that God will guide and provide even in uncertain circumstances. As we saw in verse 8, it was by faith Abraham obeyed when God called him to leave home and go to another land. He went without knowing where he was going, but he did it through trust. This trust for us might mean taking on something relatively as simple as moving to a new job, starting a new relationship, or taking on a new role here at church. It can also, I believe, potentially being willing to uproot yourself from places, both actual and spiritual, where you're deeply connected, if that's what you sense God is calling you to do. As you remember, when God called Abraham to leave Ur, he responded by obeying the command to go, even when he didn't know where he was going. His faith wasn't rooted in his security of his present circumstances, but in his trust in God's promises. For some of my relatives, for many years, faith and obedience meant fleeing from areas where religious practices were forbidden to go to a new place to live out that call in their life. Secondly, worship is essential to the journey. Abraham's willingness to go wherever God led him was driven by his desire to honor and worship God. Today, we can take from this the importance of making worship and relationship the focal point, even when it might require a significant change or personal adjustment. Abraham didn't leave his worship of God in Ur. He faithfully carried it with him into the new place, just as many others have done throughout the years, taking their worship with them to the place they are called to go. He left Ur looking forward to the city with foundations, an eternal promise that went beyond temporary and earthly. God led him and Sarah to a place they could worship Yahweh alone, away from the other gods. Just as some of our faith and biological, in my case, relatives, migrate out of times of persecution and sought and seek today the ability to live out their faith as they are called to, free from oppression. The journey that Abraham and Sarah went on was often about pursuing a promise. Obedience may involve sacrifice. Abraham left behind his home, everything familiar to him. This teaches that God may call us to leave behind things that give us personal comfort or even security to embrace God's fuller purpose. Obedience to God sometimes requires prioritizing God's will over worldly attachments, and sometimes those attachments are very deep. I think especially in places where we are deeply rooted. There's a hardwired human desire, seemingly, to be here in a place and stay. That's a very human understanding. But we know that Abraham left Ur, living as a stranger in the promised land, living in tents, waiting for the fulfillment of what God had promised. And though Abraham was promised the land, he never fully settled there during his lifetime. He lived as an outsider as part of this journey, knowing the promise wasn't just for him, but for the future. Same as some of the stories we heard earlier. They left and found places where they could settle, but had to adapt to new realities. As I shared, when my biological ancestors immigrated to Russia in the 18th century, they were granted land and religious freedom, but they lived among a vast amount of people who were different in language and culture and religious outlook. Their status as outsiders was a constant reminder of their commitment to faith and the obedience to God's calling. And if we're talking about sacrifice, let's not forget how Jesus willingly followed God's will, coming to earth, fully aware his mission would lead to his sacrificial death. His obedience was an act of love and redemption, fulfilling God's plan to save humanity. The challenge I will leave with you today is, what are you willing to sacrifice for obedience? Just like Jesus, Abraham and Sarah were called to give up everything that they knew to follow God's call and leave it behind. The story reminds us that obedience to God often requires sacrifice, letting go of personal comfort, familiar routines, even treasured attachments to prioritize God's greater purpose. I sometimes wonder if, because many of us have lived in relative ease in this place for maybe 9, 10, 11 or more generations, we've bought into the idea that this is an exceptional place. Maybe it is. But are we also willing to think that maybe, just maybe, God is calling us to a new time and a new place? Not everyone, but maybe some people will be called to do that. Might it be time to ask God to help us think what it might mean to stand up for God's call in this place, in this time? Is our church being asked to embrace something and take risks for the sake of the gospel? Are we ready to prioritize something in God's call, even if it might be challenging? Even it might look odd to others or lead to us being ostracized? As you go through the next week, I would like you to prayerfully consider these things. What comforts might God be asking you to leave behind? Are there aspects in your lifestyle, your tradition, or your preferences that may hinder your ability to fully trust and follow God? What worldly securities may be holding you back from full obedience? Are they possessions, financial goals, or relationships that you're relying on more than God? How can our church community model radical obedience to God's will? What might we collectively be willing to give up of time, of resources, or even our comfortable niche in this community to align ourselves better with God's mission for our community in the world? I'm suggesting that we let Abraham's faith inspire us to embrace the unknown, trust in God's leading, and step boldly, knowing God's plans are always greater than our own. Remember what Jesus said to his disciples: "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me." What might God be asking us to carry today? As the worship team comes forward, let's close in a time of prayer. God, you know our hearts and our desires. Please help us to remember that your promises are unchanging and that you ask us to trust in you. In a world that often demands our loyalty and our allegiance, please help us to remember your call to serve as we are called to serve, to stand with those who don't have anyone to stand with them, and to love like you love. Amen.
The team invites you to stand with